Okay, so thank you very much. I wanted to say welcome to everyone this afternoon and say how disappointed I am that we're not in person. We thought we were going to make it today, but as you know, the college had to take over the alumni house to house some of the students who had COVID and could not go home because they were so far, some of the international students. And so we decided just to make our event virtual today. And so Elizabeth and I were just discussing there are advantages to Zoom, and we're thankful. We have a wonderful group today. About 80 women have registered, and we have Nora Keenan in Minneapolis, Sylvia Mackey in Maryland, and I don't know who else, but we have a very good group. And I just wanted to say before we get started today that our book for next time is Anne Height, Where the Souls Go. That's our October book, and we're going to try to do that in person. But I want to stress again, be sure to go to the website and look at your email messages because we may have to change again. And we are going with our earlier time because we're avoiding Atlanta traffic by starting in the afternoon before the traffic starts. So what we like to do with our guest speakers is I like to ask them first, I will introduce Elizabeth Cobbs and tell her to tell us a little bit about her personal life, where she is and what she's doing. And then she will throw it back to me and then I will introduce her as a historian that she is. Elizabeth, we're delighted to have you today.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's really great to see all these mostly names, but some faces. And like yourself, I wish we could all be sitting down together, but this is great. You know, we get to come from every far and near. Well, I feel like I'm going to be talking so long now. I'm not sure what to say about myself, but I can tell you that you might hear from two poodles.
We love dogs.
I have two dogs and a cat, but the cat's mostly silent. You know, he just meows when he's hungry. So if you hear a yep, yap, that's my dog getting excited about something or other. And other than that, you know, I'm married. I have a couple of kids. They're grown. You know, someday grandkids. I know some of you have them already, and I'm envious. So that's it.
And you're in California, you said, on sabbatical?
Yes, I'm in California today. I live here and in Texas. I know that's kind of crazy, but I guess I kind of am. You know, both wonderful places. But right now I'm in California, which is where I'm from. I grew up here in San Diego, actually in California, and I'm on sabbatical this semester working on a new book.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, you'll be telling us about that later. Well, I wanted you all to know that Elizabeth graduated and got her PhD at Stanford, and she is the Melbourne Glascott Chair of History at Texas A&M. As she said, she divides her time between Texas and California. And she is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. And she has written 8 books. And it's very interesting. 5 of them are nonfiction histories. And
I can't.
Carolyn, you've been put on mute by accident, so you're going to come back off.
Oh, how much have you heard that I've
That
said?
introduction was way too long.
Yeah. Well, I was telling you.
We lost you. You basically can pick back up 8 seconds. It wasn't bad.
Well, I was just saying that, I don't know what Elizabeth.
You were saying I'd written 8 books and 3 of them were
8
fiction.
books. You've written 8 books. 3 are fiction, The Hamilton Affair, Broken Promises, and The Tubman Affair, and The Tubman Command. And then you wrote the 5 nonfictions, but I'm really interested in The Hello Girls, America's First Soldiers, female soldiers, and it's becoming an off-Broadway play. That's exciting. And I'm a historian of women too, so I love to tell the stories of the women that have been forgotten. So please share with us about your book, The Tubman Command.
All right. Well, thank you again so much for inviting me. And I know some of you have even perhaps read it, so that's even more exciting to me. I started to write this book. It was my 3rd historical novel. And as I've written more in the fiction category, I've really come to appreciate what it does to really understand history. And actually, after I completed this novel, I read about new studies by scientists taking MRIs of the brain, and they figure that your brain lights up, a different part of your brain lights up when you read nonfiction from when you read fiction. And the part of your brain that MRIs see kind of, get excited when you read fiction is the same part of your brain as when you're remembering and re-experiencing things that happened to you yourself. So one of the interesting and curious things about fiction is that we tend to remember it better because it's like remembering something that happened to us. And it also creates more empathy for the characters. You sort of feel like you're in their shoes. And I just thought that to me is so lovely, especially when you think of someone like Harriet Tubman. And it's hard for most of us to imagine walking in her shoes, which is not just a matter of race. I mean, I'm white, but it's also a matter of time, and it's a matter of circumstance. No one has been enslaved in America in 150 years. And what was that like? And not just that, what was it like to be a spy and a scout? So, I mean, I just think her whole story makes me kind of crazy. So I'm going to share my screen because I do have a PowerPoint, being a professor type. So let's see, this should work. Let's hold on to do that. Sorry, I'm on sabbatical this semester, as I said, and so one consequence of that is that my fingers are all thumbs at the moment when it comes to PowerPoints. Well, here we go. So Harriet Tubman, of course, most people think of her as being the Underground Railroad lady. And I think that most Americans, we know about Harriet Tubman about as much as you can write on a cocktail napkin. Harriet Tubman, Underground Railroad, there, and a phone number. But there's so much more to know. And I thought it was very interesting to me that most people don't realize that she was also a military figure. And I got going on this partly because I knew that there was a plan to put her on the $20 bill. And I thought, well, if she's going to be the first American woman to appear on our nation's currency, why is she representative? I mean, she was elected in a survey, about 1 million people voted and online, and she was the one selected out of 20 famous American women. But for myself, as a historian, I wanted to know, why her? So I started working on it, and let me see if I can get this going. Yes, all right, here we go. So this is the story of Harriet Tubman's raid up the Combahee River. And it's a period, of course, in the American Civil War. And what you see here is the kind of ship that this raid takes place on. It's not the very ship, but you see essentially a combination steamboat and sailboat in this case, and with an American flag at the helm, which of course during the American Civil War, if you were a Southerner, was the flag of the enemy. If you were a slave yearning for freedom, it was the flag of freedom. So when I started researching this story, one of the other reasons to research it is not only to get a lesser known story out there, but also because I find that when we research the stories of women, we have much less information and we tend to take them a little less seriously. This picture comes from the book that Carolyn was referring to, my last nonfiction book, which was about the Hello Girls, World War I women soldiers. They were so thoroughly forgotten that when they applied for military status, when they needed to show to the Veterans Administration or to the Veterans of Foreign Wars, to private clubs that they wanted to join, they always asked for their discharge papers. And because they couldn't produce them, they were essentially told you didn't exist. And yet clearly these women did exist. This is General John Pershing, who was the head of American forces in France, reviewing women soldiers in France in their uniforms, wearing their dog tags and doing all the things that soldiers did. I mean, these were soldiers who were in telecommunications. So without going into that story, one of the things I think is very interesting with women is that there is a tendency to think, well, if they've been overlooked in history, maybe it's because they didn't do stuff that was really very important. And now we're just being nice. And for diversity's sake and inclusion's sake, we're now like including these kind of minor characters. And I think part of what I'm trying to get at here is that the more we look, it's not that they were minor characters, it's just that what they did wasn't very well documented. And sometimes we have to go rescue the documentation, as I did in the case of the Hello Girls. And sometimes, this is again where fiction comes in, sometimes we don't have a lot of information on an individual. We know they existed. Let's take, why not Harriet Tubman? People will say, well, okay, so was she somebody who really did much in the Civil War? Some people claim that she was the first female military commander in American history. Well, surely that has to be an exaggeration, because otherwise wouldn't it be there in the record? And yet, what I found as a historian is that often things aren't in the record. Doesn't mean they didn't happen. Harriet Tubman has no birth certificate. How do we know she was ever alive? Okay, it wasn't documented, but apparently she was born, right? Because we have lots of evidence that she was born. In a similar way, we have evidence of her military work, although it's not in the way that people feel they have to for the thing to be real. And yet the Hello Girls were real. And by the way, to me, Carolyn asked personal things. Well, just last week, I got something that was very charming to me personally, which was the new children's book on Grace Banker and the Hello Girls of World War I, which have now been a off-Broadway play. It's been made into a documentary and now into a children's book, because once we establish these facts, people go, wow, maybe we should really learn about that and know about that. So this is kind of like my show and tell for the day. I have a copy of it, but I thought it'd be easier to show you on PowerPoint. So to Harriet Tubman, let's talk about, I want to get everybody kind of on board the same spot with, where she comes into the Civil War. And I know most of you know this story, and some of you may know it better than I do. There's all this other Civil War buffs out there, but here's the basics. So as you probably know, the war starts in April of 1861 with a bombardment of Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston. And that's really significant, not only because it starts the war, but because this becomes, in some ways, this sort of holy grail of the war. How can federal government retake, Charleston? How can they retake Fort Sumter, which is kind of where it all starts. This shows you Fort Sumter after it was effectively captured by the Confederates. And as you see, the Confederate flag is now flying over a mostly demolished structure. If you've visited it since, it's been rebuilt, but this is how it looked after that epic bombardment that launches the Civil War. Well, so what happens after that, of course, is that there is this great embargo that's established by the federal government, the Union government, across the South to try to keep out supplies from getting in. So if you've ever seen Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara, which you're from Atlanta, so chances are you have, that this embargo, right? Embargo runners like Rhett Butler were trying to get across what was called the Scott's Great Snake. This is for Winfield Scott, who was an American general who comes up with this idea. Now, the problem with an embargo is that means there are runners trying to get across it. And so the South and the North is trying to prevent the Confederacy from getting supplies from abroad, because you have to kind of picture this. The South is bigger than all of Western Europe. So from a Western European point of view, from the point of view of other great powers of the era, this is going to be a short war. Like, how can you possibly triumph over all of Europe, right? If they don't want to be a part of your union. So therefore you do get suppliers coming from Europe who think that this is going to be a short war and want to make some money off it. So what this leads to is a challenge to the federal government to find some place, a few places, where they can restock their ships. They're on this embargo. They just can't sail to the coast for fresh water or supplies because the whole area is under Confederate control. So one of the first things that happens early in the war, and you see in this map here, and I think if I use my little, I think you're seeing my little arrow here. This is the island of St. Helena, and right up here is the island of Port Royal. And these are the sea islands of South Carolina. And this, one of the first things that happens in the war is that after this embargo is established, is that there's an effort, and very successful, to find a refueling place for Union ships manning this embargo. All right, so follow me along. We're getting to Harriet Tubman, I assure you. So they bombard Port Royal, South Carolina, and take over the town of Beaufort in a day. Now, by the way, they're then marooned there for 4 years. So, so be careful what you want. This picture shows the Marines coming ashore. By the way, Marines love it when I say this. They're like, nobody ever gives us credit. So these would have been Marines coming off Navy ships, bringing the Stars and Stripes onto the island. And by the way, I always like to point out when I make this presentation that it's easy to fall into the habit of saying the North and the South. That's just an easy way to speak of that naturally. But we have to remember that, that this just really was a war of ideas, I think, more than a war of the sections, as they were called at the time. One of the men on one of those ships was Captain Percival Drayton. That's him pictured here. And Percival Drayton's brother, General Thomas Drayton, was in charge of the defenses on Port Royal Island. So both were Charlestonians. One was a Unionist, one was a Confederate. So these were men fighting over what was the meaning of America. Of course, we also have to remember that not all Southerners were white either. So there were plenty of Black Southerners who were rooting for the side of the Union. So it was, it's complicated, as we all know. So pardon my just saying North and South, but we all recognize it was about much more than that. So one of the things, of course, that happens immediately when they liberate this island or take it over is that they de facto liberate 10,000 enslaved people on these sea islands, 10,000 on these tiny little islands. And they're flooded. They suddenly, these enslaved folks become civilians, American civilians. So they have to figure out, they have to essentially mount an army effort to deal with, this massive civilian population. And as you see on the far left, you see one fella in his Union greatcoat, but most of the people are just, they now need to figure out how to fend for themselves, how to be supported, how to support themselves. So it's a colossal effort. The man who's in charge of the military side of that job is this man, Major General David Hunter. Because you have to remember, not only is this a refueling station, a resupply area for these ships, these American ships, but it's also always a launching pad to Charleston. So there's always the question of Charleston, which is very nearby. How could we sail back up to the coast? It's just a short distance. If you drive it today, I can't remember now, it's an hour or something. So sailing is, was not hard. And they're always trying to figure out how to retake Charleston, which is a tough effort. And in fact, the month before the military raid that Harriet Tubman's so involved in planning for and participates in, that the month before there had been an assault in April of 1863 on Charleston. And not only was it completely, routed, they actually lost a ship, a brand new ship. And the Union didn't have a lot of ships. So it was a big deal. So that was General David Hunter's charge. Meanwhile, the other thing he's charged with is trying to put some of these civilian men into uniforms. How can we get, Black Americans to join the military now to not only defend this island, but maybe to help in an assault on Charleston, maybe to help in an assault on the mainland. And so this, one of the things that Hunter does is that he really presses the US Congress, which initially is horrified at the idea, goodness, of giving Black soldiers guns. But he eventually prevails, and Lincoln agrees, and the Congress agrees that these men will be allowed to join. And so there are two volunteer regiments that are formed on Port Royal, and they're called the 1st and 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. And this is the first, and this unit, this, by the way, this particular depiction of them on Emancipation Day, which I'm sure some of you will know was January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Declaration went into effect. But keep in mind that the Emancipation Declaration only applied to African Americans in enemy territory, meaning those states in rebellion. So don't forget, there were slave states that did not join the Confederacy. For example, Harriet Tubman's home state. So Harriet Tubman's family, or actually she'd gotten them all out to the north, but her family and her neighbors would still have been enslaved on this day, on Emancipation Day. So it was not until the end of the war, as other states are, the Confederacy is defeated across the board, that other peoples are get their emancipation. All right. That was a depiction. That was a picture. This is actually a photograph of the first South Carolina volunteers. Now, you may be saying, okay, gosh, goodness, are we ever going to get to Harriet Tubman? Yes, we are. So Harriet Tubman is initially a part of a group of people, although she comes by herself. But there are American civilians coming from the north to help out with all of these people who are suddenly free, to teach reading, to teach writing, to help them get economically integrated. I mean, all kinds of medical nurses and doctors. But this person is sent specifically by the governor of Massachusetts. As General David Hunter, whom you just met, said, Harriet Tubman was sent to me from Boston by Governor Andrews of Massachusetts and is a very valuable woman. Now, by the way, this was written on her military pass that she could show to boatmen going back and forth between these various islands, because as a military person, you're using military transport all the time and you have to have a pass. So this is what, this is when he wrote her a pass. And this on the right is, of course, of Governor of Massachusetts. Now, I point this out partly because, again, there was a historian in South Carolina who was like, well, how important could Harriet Tubman really have been? She was a nurse. And, she made pies, which she did to earn a living, because she didn't want to take wages, because she knew that all these other former slaves were not getting, money just handed out to them by the federal government. They had to earn it, and she didn't want to. She wanted to put herself on their shoes and not get their resentment. So anyway, so some people said, well, maybe she just did that. She was a nurse. You don't send a nurse or a washerwoman on a special pass. You don't send them from Massachusetts with this vague description about their value. No one has ever described me as a valuable woman. No governor has ever sent me anywhere. So there's something there. And that's what we do, right? As historians, we're kind of always piecing together the clues. So this is Harriet Tubman as she appeared on the cover of a biography she actually commissioned after the war. She never learned to read or write. And so she commissioned a white woman to write her biography. And this was the lithograph that they commissioned at the time. And as she must have thought she appeared, right? She would have been the person seeing this and saying, oh, I'm right-handed, I'm not left-handed, whatever. And as you see, she's wearing a military greatcoat, and she's pictured in front of these tents, which were the military billeting arrangements on Port Royal Island. Now, by the way, another curious thing here is that most abolitionists of her age, she was about 40 by then, as was Frederick Douglass, who came from the same county of Maryland, who ran away from the same county of Maryland that Harriet Tubman did. Now, he did what a smart man would do. He sent his young strapping son to go in his stead. Nobody expected him to go, by the way. He's a famous writer, and most, the younger men mostly went. So why does Harriet Tubman go? What makes her so valuable? Now, one thing to remember about Harriet Tubman is that at this point, she is the only American who has had 11 years experience going behind enemy lines without ever being captured before the war starts. So she has infiltrated what to any Black person is enemy territory, in that period of time, because she could have been caught, she could have killed, she could have been in prison, she could have been re-enslaved. There was a bounty on her head of thousands of dollars. People wanted this woman bad. And yet she is the only American we know of who went back so repeatedly, never caught, brought as many people back as she did. She was something special. She was very valuable as a spy. So let's talk a little bit about who she was. I was thinking, people are like, well, I guess she's just a rock star. I could never do this. How could anybody be so brave? And then again, I use my foil here as this one historian from South Carolina who kind of poo-poos the whole thing. Oh, it's interesting to read. I like that actually when historians do, amateur or professional, because it makes me as a professional really rethink what I know and do deeper research to be sure, which is our job. So this is actually the wanted ad that was posted for Harriet Tubman before she was known as Harriet Tubman, when she first ran away in 1849. And if you look about the middle of this paragraph, you'll see the words Minty. She was actually, her mother and father named her Araminta. Her mother's name was Harriet. She subsequently, Araminta, married a man named, whose last name was Tubman, John Tubman. And so that's how she got the last name Tubman. And she after she ran away, she took her mother's name. Now, why would she do that? You have to keep in mind, if you are living in hiding, if you are in the, what do we call it today? The witnesses program, the protected witnesses. I'm forgetting the name of it in a hurry here, but you know what I mean? When people go into hiding, they change their names. They don't write letters. You know, they try to prevent themselves from being captured again. So Araminta renamed herself Harriet, and that was her mother's name, Harriet Tubman. And she was about 27 years old. You notice here that it says she was of a chestnut color, fine looking, and about 5 feet high. Now, by the way, I love the fine looking because, you know, when you're posting a runaway ad, this is not meant to be a compliment. It's not like good hair day. This is like, how do you pick someone out of a crowd? Well, you're looking for, I guess, a pretty woman who's about 5 feet tall, who's kind of moderate skin color, not super dark. And so this is who she was. And by the way, she tried to run away with her two brothers and they got scared. And so they all went home. And she left again a couple months later without them. Don't follow me this time. It's too dangerous, right? Because if anybody turns back, oh my gosh, you know, the consequences could be disastrous. And by the way, some therefore say, well, gosh, how come she could be so brave? And one speculation has been that, you know, Harriet Tubman, another thing about her bravery is that we've all heard about and know, I'm sure many of us know, people who come out of military conflicts disabled veterans. Harriet Tubman was disabled when she went into the Union Army, when she started working for the Union Army, and she got her disability here in this store. This is a picture I took in Cambridge, Maryland, where she grew up. And this is a store that she walked into one morning when she was about 11, 12 years old. Again, because we don't have a birth certificate, we don't exactly know what year she was born. Again, we do know she exists. We don't have this paper evidence that we think is so important, but we have other kinds. So when she walked into the store that day, okay, I'm trying to get my thing to advance. There we go. This is the interior of that store. She went, suddenly a man came in behind, a kid actually ran in behind her into this fairly small space. And a man comes in after him, charging after him. It's a black kid, and the man is white. He's an overseer. And he comes in and he yells to everybody, stop that kid. You know, yeah. And he's armed, you know, he's got a whip or whatever, he's, you know, and he's got his fist, he's a grown-up. And he comes in, and what happens is that the kid loops around this stovepipe here and runs out behind. And the man picks up essentially what you see right here. This is a make weight. You see the scale here in the middle of the picture. And off to the side, you see these like heavy metal objects, which are the weights they would put on scales to balance them to see how much something was weighed. And he picks up one of these make weights, which are really heavy little objects. My goodness, pick it up and you'll see. And he chucks it at the boy. Well, Harriet Tubman has put up her arms. She's a kid still. She's 11, 12. She's put up this kid, arms to defend a child roughly her own age, maybe a bit younger, who runs behind her. And the man throws the weight, and instead of hitting the kid, he hits Harriet Tubman in the head and breaks her skull. She's, you know, unconscious, very seriously injured, almost dies. Her skull is literally cracked, but she recovers. But she has a disability from that point onward. She has what we call temporal lobe epilepsy, which means that she can have seizures unexpectedly, unplanned, at any moment. So here's a person who willingly exposes themselves going into enemy territory to rescue other family members and friends who've been enslaved, to get them out, and who never knows when she herself could collapse. right? So she's got all kinds of strategies. How is she going to deal with it? What she's going to say? How does she cope with that fact? How does she build trust from the people who are following her, knowing that? Which I thought was so interesting to me when I was writing the book. I'm like, how does she convince these white officers, these American generals, to trust her when they know that in a certain way she can't trust herself? Now, some people also have speculated that maybe this is why she's so brave. Many of us have heard about how when you have brain trauma, brain injury, there's personality changes. And maybe she lost her ability to feel fear. That explains why Harriet Tubman's so brave. Well, then what explains her throwing up her arms to protect another child, roughly her age? It's because she started out pretty brave. There was just something in her. She was a fighter from a little kid on. So when she got to South Carolina, one of the first people she looks up is this man, Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He was the commander of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, the first regiment I told you about of Black American soldiers. And earlier, this is from an earlier letter he wrote to his mom when Harriet Tubman used to give talks in Boston before the war. And he wrote to his mother, "We have had the greatest heroine of the age here, Harriet Tubman." So he knew her and, knew her pretty well. Spoken to her on many occasions before she came south. And so she comes south to volunteer in whatever capacity she can be used in. And he's one of the people she sees right away. She also sees people like this woman, Susie King Taylor, who was with Wentworth's unit, the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. And I include this quote from her because, again, sometimes people will say, that picture of Harriet Tubman holding a musket, holding a rifle, that's just kind of hyperbole. Women didn't do that back then, and Harriet Tubman wouldn't have done it. Well, Susie King Taylor wrote her memoirs, which were published by Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Actually encouraged her to publish her memoirs. By the way, another person he encouraged to publish her first venture into writing, Emily Dickinson. He was Emily Dickinson's mentor, and the reason why Emily Dickinson's poems, saw the light of day. And Susie King Taylor later said, "Oh, I learned how to handle musket very well while in the volunteers," because they were on these islands. They're so close to the mainland that you can hardly. I personally, by the way, when I drove there the first time, I didn't know I'd crossed onto the island. I thought I just crossed another bridge. I'd crossed to several, and I pull up to a restaurant, and I'm like, "Wait a minute." Waze is telling me, Google's telling me I'm now on this island, but I never knew I was on an island. Well, you almost don't, especially when the tides go down and it's just kind of mud flats. Anyway, so they had to know how to defend themselves from a Confederate army, which was within rifle shot for 4 years. So you learned. So that's Susie King Taylor, who was also there. Now I'm all building you up to the story of that morning, which we're getting there really soon. So this is also the question of what role did intelligence play in the American Civil War? Intelligence is one of the operations that's the most closely cloaked. It is not well documented. Oh, by the way, one of the things that Carolyn didn't mention to you, but I at one point served for 6 years on the U.S. State Department's, what do we call it, the Historical Advisory Committee. And one of our jobs was to make sure that the secret documents of the American government that the public should know about eventually, that they're declassified. And I'll tell you, the hardest group to get to declassify anything is the CIA, because spies don't want to talk about what they did, who they talked to, and how they went about collecting evidence. Because if they do, somebody could get killed down the line. So Harriet Tubman didn't write down what she did, and nor did anybody else. But Robert E. Lee said to one of his own, officers the month before these very events, writing about a different set of events, but he said, "The chief source of information to the enemy is through our Negroes." Now, he said it something like, in the context was something like, well, of course, we all know this, by the way. And it's interesting, of course, he used the word Negroes because in his era, at his class, and as a man of great wealth, he would use that word instead of slaves. That was, polite. Of course, for the person who was enslaved, it was just, sugarcoating on something which was very painful, very, very risky, very dangerous way to live your life, or could be, often was. So anyway, so this problem, this information was through the slaves, but how do you get in to see the slaves? Because of course, slaves are, they're the ones who know, they know where the stores are being kept, meaning the supplies, they offload stuff, they store stuff, they pull it out of warehouses, they know the troop movements, but you've got to get in to find those people and talk with them. And one of Harriet Tubman's actually better documented jobs on that island was to interrogate people who were kind of coming off the mainland, because these islands were close. They were, by the way, alligator infested swamps, and if you step into them, the mud comes up to your waist, so it's very dangerous to try to get across, but people did. And one of her jobs was to debrief, if you will, slaves who were coming across. Now, by the way, they were not excited, those people, to talk to whites, as you can imagine. So to have someone like Harriet Tubman there to interrogate and question and document what these people, what they knew, was very important. And her job was also to get on to the mainland and find out what people knew, so that, as Robert Lee would later affirm, that this intelligence was largely coming through the enslaved population. All right, so I think this might, there we go. So one of the problems, not only do you have to get past the mud, not only do you have to outwit the alligators, the other problem with getting up river, which is the way that you would infiltrate into any depth on the coastline, and you all know that, right, that kind of very wet coastline of Georgia and South Carolina and Florida, and such places, it was hard to get a ship up there because of this phenomenon, the torpedo. Now, I by the way, before I started this project, I always thought of torpedoes as like from World War II movies, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Although that particular quote actually comes to us from the American Civil War. Admiral Farragut, who saw the ship in front of him sink in about a minute's time, having hit a torpedo. And torpedoes were actually fixed water mines. They were they strung, there are various ways to basically anchor them to either the bottom or to put them from the sides. And what they did to keep the Union troops and Union Navy out of the South was to mine all the major harbors, including Charleston, of course, but all the major rivers as well. So in terms of intelligence, one of the things that needed to be found out as you were sending, if you want to send boats up these rivers and any kind of amphibious assault, you had to find out where those torpedoes were. Now, the waters, the rivers in that part of the world, you may know, are called blackwater rivers, and they're called blackwater rivers often because I went and checked this out because I was just kind of curious. I wanted to see how the whole thing worked, because I'm not from there, and where I hang out, it's pretty dry. California or Texas, is the rivers that have so much vegetation in them that they become incredibly murky, and you can put your hand in a river and not see your own fingertips. So your hand's in the water and you can't see your fingertips. That's how murky they are. Now that means you can't see a torpedo. So the only way that, in fact, Southerners can get up and down their own rivers is to know where the torpedoes are. So somebody has to know. Somebody has to know, or you can't get the cotton that you're growing and the sugar that you're growing and the tobacco that you're growing to sell to Europe, to buy those guns, to buy those uniforms, to buy that cannon powder, to buy medicine, all that stuff. You've got to be able to get stuff downriver, and you got to be able to get back up. So Harriet Tubman, or at least somebody needed to know where those torpedoes were. So this leads me to the day of the raid, which takes place on over the June 1st, roughly June 1st to June 2nd of 1863. At a time when nobody knows how this war is going to end, period. Nobody knows. It's already gone on 2 years longer than anybody thought it would, north or south. This is before a month and a half, or no, a little less than a month, 6 weeks, 5 weeks before the battles of Vicksburg and Gettysburg, which are the real turning point in the war. where it starts to seem like, oh, wait, actually maybe the Union will win. Nobody. By the way, I wrote my first novel about Charles Francis Adams, who was the American ambassador to Great Britain at the time. The Adamses, meaning the son of John Quincy Adams, the grandson of John Adams, that family thought there was no way the North was going to win. I mean, they were going to, put up a good fight, but they thought it was not likely because it wasn't likely. So this is a time when this kind of raid has great significance. To take the first uniformed Black American soldiers upriver to liberate their own people and to burn Confederate stores and, and if possible, land a victory. So this all happens on the Combahee River, South Carolina. And what happens is that there are 3 ships that sat out. One, by the way, immediately snags on a sandbar. Hey, that wasn't Harriet Tubman's job. That's the Navy's job, I'm pretty sure. So that one of the ships hangs up, and they get 2 ships upriver. Now they're creeping up this river because not only does somebody find out where the torpedoes are, but somebody also finds out that they've taken down the artillery at the mouth of the river like 2 weeks before. It got sent off, just a switch out going to Savannah, basically. Somebody has also found out that the Confederate Army of 2,000 veterans, which is camped only 10 miles away, so a short horseback ride, very short ride, that commander is new to his job and hasn't been drilling people and doesn't know the local terrain. So somebody figures that out too. And so they figure out that this is a time when maybe a strike could be successful. So as they go upriver that day, essentially they're coming into rice growing territory. And so they're coming upriver and they're seeing things like this. If you've ever seen, and of course you still can, if you go to the Combahee River, if you go to parts of, especially in South Carolina, you'll still see vestigial, really, rice fields. And they're, they have these channels in between the rice fields for, taking things up and down river, and also to flood the fields when they need to flood the fields to get fresh water into the growing plants. And this is what happens is that on that morning, 2 ships go upriver. They get all the way upriver. They infiltrate enemy territory 25 miles. They lose no soldiers. They burn 4 plantations to the ground. They destroy immense quantities of stores that are going to be used to, especially to sell for income for the Confederacy. And they end up liberating 756 people without any deaths, at least none of their own. There are a couple people killed on land, but the military skirmish never really arises because the Confederates arrived too late. Now, what you see here, of course, is this a depiction. This is from Harper's Weekly, and it shows the American flag on the back, on the stern of one of the boats, and people trying to jump off the shore and get on board. I had seen this picture before I started, really writing the book. What I did not know is the whole page in which that picture appears. This is the entire page from Harper's Weekly, which gives us insight into what's the significance actually of this raid. This is the same picture. Some of you, if you've ever done any research on American slavery, just Google American slavery. The picture in the middle of this triptych is probably the most famous image of American slavery and the worst kinds of damage done to people. This was a man who on the left, it shows him coming shuffling in rags to a Union encampment. He takes off his shirt so the doctor can examine him for fitness as a soldier. This picture is taken of his back, which shows the scars from years and years of being whipped. And on the right-hand side of this triptych, it shows a new man. It shows a man in uniform who is a man who's able to defend himself, his land, his country, his family. And so this Harriet Tubman raid is in this same context, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to recruit men to join the human army, Union Army. Well, I could say human army, human rights. So what happens is that they do get upriver. Harriet Tubman is on that lead ship. And she's recounts that later. She doesn't talk about developing the intelligence. Others talk about her role in that. She just talks about being there and helping people get on board and going off, finding people, getting them on as fast as they could so they can turn around and come back downriver 25 miles, hopefully without being sunk, because these are wooden ships. Colonel James Montgomery is the man leading the raid, and this is another piece of evidence we have about Harriet Tubman. Logically, it should have been Thomas Wentworth Higginson who was given this great honor of launching the first major assault by Black troops. If you've seen the movie Glory, that's an event that takes place about 3 weeks after this, maybe 5. I can't remember now. 5 weeks after that. So that raid, which is much more famous because lots of people die, takes place well after this raid. And Colonel James Montgomery should have been the guy in charge, but instead, it should have been Higginson, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, but instead it's Montgomery. And why Montgomery? Who, by the way, calls Tubman, as you can see, a most remarkable woman and invaluable as a scout. Well, Harriet Tubman says she was the one who told Hunter, who asked her to go. And she said, I will only go if you appoint Montgomery. I don't want Wentworth Higginson, who's her good friend, by the way, whom she has every reason to favor. But what she knows about Montgomery is that he rode with John Brown. And John Brown was somebody whom Harriet Tubman knew and knew fairly well, who of course was considered, the first white man to sacrifice his life to try to organize a rebellion, and therefore very precious to her memory and to the memory of, other enslaved peoples. So it's, again, this is how historians, as Carolyn will attest, we're often drawing from lots of disparate sources to try to, how do we corroborate stories? How do we know stories? How do we know how they happened? And we have to use all different kinds of evidence for that. So the fact that it's not Higginson, that it's Montgomery, and she provides a clue as to why that is very telling. Rufus Saxton was actually the general in charge of civilian maintenance, so to speak, on Port Royal Island. He also knew Tubman well and wrote afterwards in her application for a veteran's pension. He said Tubman was a spy who made many a raid inside the enemy's lines, displaying remarkable courage, zeal, and fidelity. This is how Harriet Tubman would have looked around that time. This is a picture, we don't have a date on it, but this is approximately the age that she was when she served with the Union Army, roughly 40. By the way, this photograph was only discovered about 5 years ago, maybe. And while I was writing the book, and I only had all the pictures of Harriet Tubman like my age, kind of middle age and more filled out, and her hair is all gray. And so I kept thinking, well, if she was 40, and by the way, she was married twice and she was considered a pretty woman. So I was trying to imagine in my own mind, what she would be like if she was a romantic heroine, which is how I conceive of her. So when I saw this, I always think to myself, I'd think, well, now let's see, if she had a more modern haircut and was smiling, as people tended not to do in 19th century photos, and if she was laughing, and if she had makeup on, what would she look like? But she must have been a rock star, pretty for the period of time. Anyway, when the raid was over that morning, and by the way, it was a dark and stormy night, because it actually was a dark and stormy night. When they escaped, they had instead of 3 boats, they now had 2 boats. These were wooden ferry boats, former ferry boats repurposed, with military troops on them. 300 troops are on these 2 boats, and now they have another 750 people. And a huge storm comes up off the coast of South Carolina. And these ships almost sink. So it's crazy. But they make it back. And what they do is, the first thing they do is they come into this church, which that's how it looked then. This is how it looks today. Ebenezer Baptist Church in South Carolina in Beaufort. And Harriet Tubman gives a speech. Now, by the way, Colonel James Montgomery speaks first because he's the commander. And he's trying to encourage these, because they're about half men, and he wants to encourage them to join the Union forces. Now, keep in mind that the Emancipation Proclamation is not law, not American law. It's just a proclamation, military proclamation by the commander in chief. It doesn't become law until the Constitution is amended 2 years later. So these are people who are joining as belligerents a war in which it's not really clear, and it's not a law, that they will be free afterwards. They will be free if the Union wins. So they have a lot to lose. So he gives a speech, and then Harriet Tubman gives a speech. Now, how do we know that? And this goes back to the question of how do we document what happened? And so I want to read you the best piece of evidence we have for, I'm sorry, I have poodles and a person here, so ignore that. But what happens is that there's a journalist from Wisconsin, of all places, and journalists all over the country by that point, and he makes a note for a Wisconsin journal, and he writes, because like George Washington, I've gone blind in the service of my country. That was a famous line from George Washington. The Wisconsin State Journal says shortly thereafter, it says, Colonel Montgomery and his gallant band of 300 Black soldiers, under the guidance of a Black woman, dashed into the enemy's country, struck a bold and effective blow without losing a man or receiving a scratch. The colonel was followed by a speech from the Black woman who led the raid, and under whose inspiration it was originated and conducted. And by the way, this guy doesn't know her name, has never met her, has no idea who he's talking about. He's just, this is the woman who led the raid. Oh, good to know. For sound sense and real native eloquence, her address would do honor to any man, and it created quite a sensation. She is now called Moses, having inherited the name. She is head and shoulders above all the copperheads in the land. That means Northerners who oppose the war, and above many who vaunt their patriotism and boast their philanthropy. So what we know about Harriet Tubman is that some woman who was called Moses. Now, most people do know that Harriet Tubman called herself Moses. Why did she call herself Moses in all those years she kept going back on the Underground Railroad? Well, first of all, Moses is a man's name. It's actually the name of one of her younger brothers. And of course, it means the Savior who's coming to lead you to the promised land. And it's also a great name for a spy, because it means that people will be looking for a man named Moses. So her code name had always been Moses. And this man doesn't even know that's who she is. So if we want evidence as to it having been Harriet Tubman who developed this valuable evidence, to me, there really is no doubt. I mean, we're not going to get it to set in the military record because we also don't have a birth record either, but it's pretty clear. This is her for some more famous picture taken much later. She's now in her mid 50s by that point. She dies in her, we think, early 90s. She went back decade of, she spent 15 years going back to the South where she could have been killed at any moment. And the war is over, she never goes south again. And she lives out the rest of her life in Auburn, New York, where she bought land from the American Secretary of State, William Seward, who sold Harriet Tubman land. And she's buried there in the Auburn Cemetery. And the town raised this stone to her at the time of her death. And there's always an American flag there. And it's just a beautiful monument to her. Of course, the monument I'd love to see is a Harriet Tubman on every $20 bill that pops out of that ATM. Because the United States is the only major democracy in the world that does not have a female on its currency, on its paper currency. The only two really big countries in the world that do not have women at this point on their paper currency are Russia and China. So that's not the group we really want to be in. We'd like to be in with Mexico and Canada and Great Britain and Australia and France and our better friends, which do have their national heroines are featured on their paper currency. So that's the story. That's the book. I think some of you have read it, and I will stop sharing now and take your questions.
That was wonderful, Elizabeth. Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, the first question came from one of our students at the college, Georgia K. White. Can you hear me, Elizabeth?
I sure can.
Oh, good. She really enjoyed the book. She thought it was delightful. It was an unexpected treat, very different from other historical novels she had read. And she said that she really appreciated the small details in the book that highlight everyday life and relationships between the characters. How did you balance the need for historical context while filling in the gaps between what can't be found in research?
That's a great question. I think historical writing to me, historical fiction, I should say, is sort of like a fill in the dots. Remember those old fashioned puzzles where you follow the numbers and it's a rabbit or something at the end. We know the dots are fixed. And as fiction writers, we make up what it goes in between. You have to, otherwise the person never comes to life. And to me, my job is to make the dead stand up and walk. So they have to feel real. They have to feel human. They can't be, perfect statues on a pedestal. They have to have human foibles. They have to do stuff wrong. They have to love and care and feel embarrassed. And it's just human. I mean, I think that's how we respect people. It's kind of a funny thing. I think sometimes people think, well, if you don't just paint somebody all perfect, well, then people won't respect them. It's actually, I don't think it works that way. I think we respect people more when we know, that they struggle like us, and they get out of bed and, they clean the dishes, they do stuff they don't want to do so they can do stuff they do want to do. And so to answer the student's question, I mean, for me now I'm a professional historian, so I can't make up anything that could not have happened, right? It has to be plausible, real, probable, or at least, if not probable, not something where you think, well, no, that just couldn't happen that way. So that takes a lot of research. Like, for example, in the story, if you've read it, and I know you have, Carolyn, maybe some others, there is a character who's a thief. And Harriet Tubman actually gets accused of being a thief. This white guy is the thief, but they accused her of pilfering. Now, of course, she wouldn't do this at all, but, and it's easy. They suspect Black people of stealing. So one of the interesting things, how do we know this? Because that guy was court-martialed, and Harriet Tubman testified at his court-martial, as did a variety of other people, and he was found guilty. So one of the things I did was to use that court-martial record to make this other story, right? So I actually know his name. I know the kinds of things she bought from him. I know approximately how much sugar and flour she did purchase. Yeah, just kind of funny little details that you wouldn't think matter. And yet to create a feeling of something being real, well, we've got to get as close to real as we can. So that means just researching until you've got as much as you can find.
Well, you really do a masterful job of that. And you do have to be careful, and you have to like to do research. And I think you don't become a historian unless you like to do research. You can keep digging and find new things. That's great. And I think you answered another question that she asked about why did you choose to set the story during the Civil War as opposed to an earlier point in her life. And I think you were talking about why this incident is not as well known, and you wanted to highlight that. And I think I share with you your feeling that when you heard that Tubman was going to be on the $20 bill, you realized how little you knew about her. And I'm a historian of women, and there's so many women we don't know very much about. And so you had to dig deeper. I think that was the expression you used. But that's wonderful that you brought this story to life that we should appreciate about her, and that there's so many other women out there where if we dig deeper, we will find more about them. And so we really commend you for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think right, Carolyn. I mean, in the case of Harriet Tubman, she not only had this long pre-Civil War service to our country, right, trying to right an important wrong, but she served militarily, and then after the war, she was an important philanthropist. She started a home for the aged, which she funded and ran for a couple of decades. So she's somebody who, in all these different ways, is a model for American women, I think. And again, I want to make the point about that military raid is that it wasn't just like it was some small raid we don't need to think about. It was very important for Black soldiers to show that they could perform, because there was, of course, and honorably and well, and with heroism and valor, as can women. as the Hello Girls showed, and as Harriet Tubman herself showed, because I think that we tend to underestimate what women can do and have historically, don't now today mostly, and I think that's another reason to choose that particular story.
Mhm. Well, and I think you did a great job in your evidence of all these generals would not have said these wonderful things about her if she were not valuable, and the governor of Massachusetts would not have sent her south and given her papers and money unless she was coming as an official representative. And she certainly was valued and deserves this recognition. And I do think it's important that more Americans know about her, and your book has contributed to that. And I understand that in 2021, she was inducted into the Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame or something. And I'm thinking, it took that long. Did they finally recognize she did something?
Yeah, I had this very fun thing when we first started doing things on Zoom. The National Intelligence University, I think is the full name of it, National Intelligence University in Washington, said, "Can you give a talk on Zoom? Because we teach intelligence. We want to know, how did Harriet Tubman do it?" So that was kind of a fun talk. Talk about her intelligence techniques, her trade craft, they call it. I call it spy craft. I think it's a more interesting word, but that is the thing. How do you do this? And of course, by the way, this is relevant to your group because she found being a woman a very good cover.
Mm-hmm. Nobody would expect a woman to do what she did.
No, they didn't
hide
expect
in plain sight.
Right, she's short. She's 5 feet tall. She was very good at mimicking older people, even in her 20s and 30s. She would, get a shawl and kind of shuffle along, and again, that's a thing where people very much underestimate what somebody like that could do physically, and so she had all these techniques that she used to disguise herself, and she would flirt. Which I think is another great thing. I mean, I think most women would understand, oh yeah, that's right. Like, you just want to kind of snow somebody. What would you do?
Mm-hmm.
What persona would you adopt if you wanted to disarm somebody or charm somebody or get them to think not much about you, think you weren't much of anything, you play dumb, whatever. So she had all of these means that she used all the time. She would, for example, if she thought she was going to get caught, she would generally walk right up to somebody, just start talking to them.
Yeah.
Don't run. Never run.
Pretend she was a midwife, or I'm going to deliver a baby in the middle of the night, or something like that.
Ah, good. Yeah. Just any trick. And nobody's going to suspect a middle-aged woman, Carolyn. You and I could rob a bank.
Exactly.
We're not going.
And she must have been, not only was she small and brave, but she must have been really strong. See how long she would travel by foot, by herself or with a group of people. And it was said if somebody said they weren't going to follow, she would threaten to shoot them. I mean, like, they couldn't give up. She was tough mentally and physically to do what she did.
Well, she would have been the queen of special operations today.
Yeah, exactly.
She did carry a pistol in her years on the Underground Railroad because she found with her brothers that if people turn back, everybody can get killed because then there's a trail, et cetera, et cetera. So she started carrying a pistol. She was very physically strong before she went on the Underground Railroad. The first man she married was John Tubman. As I mentioned, he was a free man, by the way. Now, this is another little interesting thing about Harriet Tubman. The first man she married was free because at that time in Maryland, in that area of Maryland, about half of African Americans were free and half were enslaved. It was just upper South, mixture, and which is already tells us something about American slavery a lot of people don't know. So in other words, this man could have chosen, almost any woman. Why would a free man who knows his children will be enslaved ever consider marrying a woman who's enslaved? Ever. He must have thought she was something really special. She must have been, right? He must have thought she was the bee's knees or whatever. The second man she married, by the way, after the war, a veteran like herself, was 20 years her junior. Now, again, that guy could have gotten a better deal as well, right? He was a tall, pretty handsome guy. And he married a woman 20 years younger. Now she had no money, limited fame. Her fame was fading. Again, she must have just been very attractive and very charming.
Mhm.
So, but she was also very strong. And John Tubman was a logger. He had a business logging and felling trees. And she had done logging. Her father was a logger as well, enslaved. But so she was a very strong person. And they said, you know, she had these feats, personal feats of strength were quite remarkable.
Mhm. Well, she must have been, as you've pointed out in so many different ways, how outstanding she was. I just want to remind people, if anybody has any other questions, I've got some more, but they can put theirs in the chat. I don't want to monopolize all the questions, but I do want to ask you about her disability. I understand in the 1890s, she had a surgery, a brain surgery, that they tried to alleviate some of her problems, and that they did that without any kind of anesthesia or that must have been horrible. Did it do any good?
That's right. By then she was living, you know, she was in the East, and she went to Boston, to Massachusetts General Hospital, and she'd been in and out of Boston for decades. But in the 1890s, that disability always gave her bad headaches. And the headaches as she aged just got worse and worse. I mean, again, she must have had scarring in her brain from the original injury. And she, you know, she went to surgery at Massachusetts General and explained her problem and said, you know, anything they can do? They said, well, we can try. And so they did some sort of surgery on her head, on her brain, without anesthesia. I don't know why exactly, but they didn't use it. And it did apparently help. It alleviated it a little bit. It didn't really solve the problem altogether. Those aren't problems we can solve now altogether.
And I read that soldiers said that they would have no medication, but they would bite the bullet. And is that where that expression came from? I'm like, it seems like it would break your teeth biting the bullet so hard when they were having surgery.
It's fun to find that those phrases have such long duration. Like my husband and I the other day were talking about the phrase "piece of work." So-and-so is a piece of work. That goes back to Shakespeare.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Hamlet. But that sort of idea of biting the bullet, very much from the Civil War. In fact, Harriet Tubman, in her own letters, which she would dictate because she couldn't write, but she did dictate letters, and she at one point talked about the man biting the dust. Oh, so they bit the dust. Those Confederates bit the dust, which of course means that they were killed, right? So,
wow.
Old phrases.
So those are fun. Okay, and I wanted to we should remind Georgians that you mentioned Susie King Taylor. She was from Savannah, Georgia, and she was escaped from slavery herself, but she was literate, and she did write a history of her. Well, and you mentioned that, and that's where she learned to use a rifle. But I didn't know if our women realized that she was inducted into the Georgia Women of Distinction in 2018. And she is now being recognized in the state of Georgia. She ended up living in Massachusetts late in her life, but she was originally from Savannah. And she was literate, and she wrote her own book, memoir, history. Harriet Tubman was never literate. She never learned to write, did she?
No.
And I think that's one reason she did have some other people write about her. But if she could have written more or written her own story, maybe we would have known more. And maybe if there'd been letters or if there'd been a diary or anything like that, maybe her things would have been better known, her accomplishments.
Sure. Well, I mean, I wrote a book on a novel on Alexander Hamilton. And that did very well. I always like to mention, I was doing it before the great musical came out. I just had the absolutely dumb good luck for it to coincide with that. So the novel ended up doing very well. But when you look at, I think of these things as like puzzle pieces. So if you're trying to get a Alexander Hamilton puzzle, it's like having 1,000-piece puzzle that's got 1,562 pieces.
Mhm.
So it's got too many pieces. You know, you have to throw some out. Some are lies, some are fabrications. How does it all fit? But I wanted to look at his wife, Elizabeth Schuyler. Now, Elizabeth Schuyler is like a 1,000-piece puzzle for which we have 118 pieces. So how do you make a whole picture, a 1,000-piece puzzle using only 118 pieces? Because women in history have not been very well documented. In Elizabeth Schuyler's case, she actually burned her letters. Now, if you saw that musical, you know that Lin-Manuel Miranda portrays that as like, oh, I don't want anybody to know my pain. They don't, they don't have any, any right to know that. That could have been the reason, or she could have been just like Martha Washington, whom she knew very, very well. Martha Washington burned all her personal letters as well. And that was because that was an era where the idea was that you didn't want a great person, you didn't think that their personal life was anybody's business. In a way, that was what went on behind the closed doors. And what people should know about is their great public deeds. And so Martha Washington destroyed her personal letters as well, as did Elizabeth Schuyler. So women not only weren't very well documented by people around them, but they, in a way, contributed their own anonymity by not tooting their horn. And Harriet Tubman did the same thing. I don't know if she would have, if she'd been literate, recorded those things. For example, she did write by dictating a letter right after this raid. And that letter appeared in the Boston Commonwealth, a newspaper of the time. And what she wrote in the letter was, there's been a lot of newspaper coverage on this raid and, saying what a great job James Montgomery did, but I'm paraphrasing now, I'm sure you can tell. But what people really ought to be emphasizing is that this is the first raid by Black soldiers, and journalists need to talk about that because this was just so amazing.
Mm-hmm.
She never says
Anything about herself.
No.
Yeah.
I developed intelligence. Well, first of all, she's a spy. She's not going to say that.
So she's left it up to you to tell her story. But you've done a great job. Just tell us now what you're working on. This will be the last question. What are you working on now?
Well, I started out as a historian of U.S. foreign relations. So most of my books are about war. Okay, so Civil War, Harriet Tubman, that kind of fits. So most of my books have been about that subject. But in the last couple of years, in my working on war, I've kind of backed into these stories about women. Just the first women soldiers, because I was going to wanted to write about World War I. I'd written before about other wars, and then here I am writing about Harriet Tubman. So I just started down that road of writing about women and American history. And so the book I'm writing on now for Harvard Press is about history of women's rights in America from, I like to say, Abigail Adams to Beyonce. So, from colonial times up to the present, and kind of the way women's roles have shifted and changed, and how women and men have fought for equality between the sexes. And so that's it. And I'm almost done. I'm on chapter 7 out of 8.
Well, good for you. Well, I've written a book about a Civil War woman that lived in Georgia that became president of the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association in 1899. So same thing. So congratulations. I'm glad you're doing that, and I look forward to reading that. And we've really enjoyed having you with us today. And this is just a little personal note. Remember to send me your mailing address. I have something I want to send you in the mail. And thank you very much for giving us your valuable time. We've enjoyed it and learned a lot from you today.
Thank you, Paul. I really enjoyed it too. Thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, and ladies, we'll see you next month with Ann Hyde.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.